Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is the inaugural episode of Beyond the Evaluation, entitled Week 1 Introduction The Kinetic Chain. My name is Brandon Platt. I hold a doctorate in athletic training from A.T. Still University. I hold a master's in exercise science kinesiology from the University of Georgia, and a bachelor's in athletic training from Franklin College in Franklin, Indiana. The whole purpose of this series is to give a better understanding of some of the hot button issues going on both in athletic training, physical therapy, and throughout the collegiate, professional, high school athletics landscape with regard to injuries, evaluation, and rehabilitation techniques. We wanted to take some of the more high profile injuries and showcase them, not to be very specific to the case in question, but to take the injury and give a better understanding, because it's in the media, about what exactly the athlete who sustains this injury, be it a high school athlete, a collegiate athlete, a professional athlete, what have you, is actually going through with regard to the evaluation process, with regard to the rehabilitation process, and with regard to overall return to play. This is not meant to be critical of anyone. This series is not meant to be extremely specific to any one injury or situation, as every injury is very, very different. However, it is meant to give kind of an overview and provide high quality information for both the general public and our clinical colleagues. And so we really wanted to try to get this information out there to be the best resource it could possibly be. And we welcome any suggestions as far as future content goes. To start out with, our first episode will be regarding the kinetic chain. In order to have an understanding of any injury that occurs, we first need to have an understanding of the kinetic chain. Full disclosure, my world is that of the overhead throwing athlete. It has become kind of my area specialty over the last 10 or so years that I've been practicing, although I've experienced throughout all areas of athletic training. It kind of has become my passion. Former baseball player myself, the throwing motion really stresses the kinetic chain, I feel, as well, if not better, than any other motion within the athletic universe. So that's kind of where I wanted to start with. The kinetic chain is basically the connection of all areas of the body to each other. And if you think of the body as links in a chain, we know that if one link is broken, then others will fail in time as well. What the kinetic chain is very, very good at, and what it allows the athlete to do, is to proper sequence motions in order to prevent injury and perform at their highest level. So the example that I really wanted to use today in discussing the kinetic chain as our first kind of area in order to kind of introduce overall injury evaluation process and rehabilitation alike is the baseball pitcher. And if we look at the feet as a base of support, but the ball coming out of the upper extremity, we have to use principles of the kinetic chain in order to fully produce the amount of forces necessary to throw a baseball at the highest possible elite level. So just some background on the throwing motion, and this may be kind of review, but I wanted to make sure that I touched on this. The throwing motion consists of the following steps. The wind-up, the stride phase, the cocking phase / late cocking phase, acceleration, deceleration, and follow-through. And if you have any experience with the throwing athlete or with those who throw, a lot of injuries to the throwing athlete that occur at the arm will occur during the deceleration phase if we're talking about the thrower, or during the if we're talking about the shoulder, or during the late cocking phase for both the shoulder and the elbow. Though all these areas are very, very important, especially when we're looking at the entirety of the throwing sequence. We're talking about the necessary steps to produce the force from the ground to the arm in order to throw a baseball, and then trying to find out where the efficiencies lie so we can ultimately prevent injuries down the way even in the asymptomatic athlete. Deficits to any part of this sequence will eventually lead to injury and increase the risk of injury to the athlete if they play long enough. So we need to be able to identify where these deficiencies lie. I mentioned the throwing shoulder and elbow, and in future episodes we will get into some specifics as far as rotator cuff issues, labral pathology, and injuries, elbow injuries, both to Tommy John and related posterior elbow issues, osteophytes, that sort of thing, as we kind of move through this series. But today I wanted to focus specifically on the throwing shoulder. On the kinetic chain. If we look at dysfunction to the ankle leading to dysfunction at the hip, which leads to dysfunction in the core, which leads to dysfunction up the chain to the shoulder, we can basically deduce that the throwing shoulder is directly affected by the ankle. It's directly affected by the hip. And a lot of times as clinicians, we look at the area that is injured, and we don't so much look at the area that may be causing the injury. For example, if an athlete comes in to me with pain in their shoulder, of course I'm going to assess the area of pain, because the pathology, the direct dysfunction is probably symptomatically at that area. However, is the problem being caused at its root at that area? And if it's not, if the problem is farther down the kinetic chain, obviously we are going to set ourselves up for recurrence of injury. We're not providing the best possible care to the athlete ultimately, because we're not reducing the athlete's injury risk and getting them back on the field for an extended period of time. So we need to make sure that even though musculoskeletal injuries may end up presenting themselves at one part of the body or another, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where the actual dysfunction is occurring, which are causing those injuries to happen. And that's where the kinetic chain comes in. So when we look at the throwing motion specifically, we start at the bottom and work our way up. At least that's how I've found to be the most effective. And when starting at the bottom and working my way up, I look at range of motion at the ankle. Are there dysfunctions at the ankle? Does the athlete have foot or ankle injuries in the past? And we work our way to the knee. If there's no issues at the ankle, okay, has there been an injury to the knee? If the athlete has a history of MCL injury or ACL injury, does that dysfunction change the way the athlete moves? Is that going to change, is a meniscal tear going to change the way the athlete rotates on the lower half, particularly on the back or the front side, regardless of which knee it is? That's going to affect their rotational ability and their ability to stay in sequence throughout the throwing motion. This leads us directly to the hip. If we have an athlete who has a tight front hip or has dysfunction in the front hip, this will directly impact one way or another the ability to clear the front side, and ultimately will lead to the throwing shoulder, the back shoulder, being either early, late, putting more stress through the throwing shoulder where it should be transposed through the core and through the hip, because all of these forces we know have to go somewhere. And so to me, those first three steps, the ankle, the knee, and the hip in the throwing athlete, are so incredibly important when we're looking at the kinetic chain as it relates to the throwing shoulder. Now, could we have an issue where there's an acute injury and an athlete falls on their shoulder and dislocates their shoulder? Of course. Is that going to be due to the kinetic chain? Maybe, maybe not. If it's a very high impact injury, such as if it's a contact injury such as football, perhaps not. But it's always a good principle to kind of keep that in mind after we've evaluated the site of the injury, to see what other areas of dysfunction may be occurring, particularly when we're talking about chronic overuse injuries, as in the throwing athlete, as in the kicking athlete with a soccer player. things of that nature that directly revolve around multiple areas of the body being in the correct sequence to, one, produce a high level of performance, and two, to produce the amount of forces necessary to compete in that sport while mitigating the risk of injury. Particularly in the throwing athlete, we know that these forces are higher than at the upper extremity, are faster and higher than any other force throughout human movement with regard to athletics. And so the force has to go somewhere, and it has to dissipate somehow, and we have to be able to transpose those forces. So that's very, very important, particularly when we talk about transferring force. So as I was saying, obviously the hip and plays a really big role in that back shoulder. But by the same token, if we have an upper extremity injury, or we have upper extremity dysfunction, tightness in the non-throwing shoulder, can that directly affect the throwing shoulder? And the answer to that is yes, it absolutely can. And so I think that it's very, very important as we move through some of these injuries, regardless if it's a throwing athlete, if it's a running athlete, in our cross-country runners with regard to stress fractures, stress reactions at the shins, when we talk about hamstring injuries in football players, hip flexor injuries in football players, or even bony injuries in some of our athletes with previous histories of injuries. I think it's very, very important that we look at the underlying cause of some of these issues, because when we get to the overall rehabilitation of some of these, rehabilitation of some of these injuries, it's going to ultimately affect how we rehabilitate these athletes, how we get them back to full return to play, and how we keep them on the field. That's really going to be important. So that's kind of the overview of the kinetic chain. Just a brief review. It's a very important concept when we're talking about injury. And if we have any broken links in that chain from the ground up or from the top down, when we're looking at any sort of injury, it's going to be very, very important. So as a clinician, that should really drive your evaluation of the process. The kinetic chain will come back up throughout the series, and as we talk about specific injuries, we'll talk about the specific kinetic chain impacts of those injuries. So we hope that you'll join us next time for episode 2 of Beyond the Evaluation, and we'll get in depth to some of these injuries occurring throughout the world of sports. Please leave your comments for us. We'd love to hear your feedback. We hope that this is the best resource it can possibly be for everyone involved. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.